laboratory data to make sound agronomic decisions. So why even have an agronomist? Agronomist has studied the field of plant biology, plant physiology, soils, fertility. They have a very good understanding of how to manipulate the environment. And we do it scientifically with application in the field, right? So Agronomy 101. So when I'm an agronomist and I go to your, if it's a grow or if it's a ranch or whatever it is, one of the first things I start to look at is, what is your nutrient budget? And I don't mean that in the way of dollars. I mean in the way of, what is the crop requirement? Because depending on the variety, depending on your growing conditions, depending on if your soil or if your substrate, that is what's going to dictate what that crop requirement is. And if you're talking to me, I'm going to ask you, do you understand what a crop nutritional curve is? So what that means is, over time, how much nutrition is your crop taking in, of what nutrition and of what quantity? And so those are some factors that we look at as agronomists, and in order to manipulate your fertility program. The other side of this is measurement. We cannot change or adjust anything if we're not measuring. And utilizing laboratory data is one of the #1 ways that we help growers, because we give you insight to what's happening either in the soil, within the plant, within our feeding program. All of those are measured by laboratory data. And so this is something that we key in on significantly at our company. So I'm going to get in, what my plan is, I'm going to get into some of the tools that we use. I'm going to show you how we utilize them. Kyle Maccabee is an associate of ours. He'll be coming up afterwards to talk a little bit about the pesticide application side and what some of the things that the hemp and the cannabis side are having to deal with. And so he'll talk on that. But let me get into the budgeting, the nutrient budgeting. So when we build a nutrient budget, we're looking at our sources, our soil, okay? It's a source of nutrition. Our irrigation water, that's a source of nutrition. And then what we apply in the way of application, or if we're in ground, if we have a cover crop, that's a supply of nutrition. And so what we do is, just like a bank account, we go through and we say, okay, this crop requires X amount of nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, cal, whatever it is, the whole 18 essential elements. And we put it into more or less a form that we can determine what our adjusted requirement is, because we have to take in consideration how much we're applying, how much we're removing, all those things. And so then we take that information and we apply it over the life of the crop. And it's timing, physiological timing. So if we're going, in the case of hemp or cannabis, if we're going from veg to bloom, those are two different fertility programs, okay? To promote, that particular crop stage. So what we do is we provide a roadmap. That's what this is. It's a roadmap for a grower. This can be done indoors or in the field. This is more applicable for in the field. But that's what we're going to start with, because it's going to give the framework for the grower to understand, this is what we need, and this is how we're going to get there. It's not necessarily the exact way we're going to get there, but it's going to be at least a roadmap. So here's just a blown up version of that. So we have, here, hold on. There we go. So here's step 1. We have an NPK, Cal Mag. It's just our budget. That's a requirement for that particular crop. And this is for field application, so it's in pounds. If you go through the steps here, we include our soil, what our green waste or compost is providing, what's our irrigation providing. We also evaluate soil chemistry and water chemistry, because that's going to dictate what's going to be available. And then we eventually get down here to an adjusted requirement. And we also consider leach fraction. So if you're on flood irrigation, your leach fraction is 60%. That means you're going to lose 60% of your fertilizer just to leaching. If you're on drip, you're going to be about 25% leach fraction. So that means you're going to lose at least 25%. There's no perfect system when it comes to applying fertility, unless you have a recirculation system in a greenhouse on tables, okay? So when we take this, we apply a factor. It's an agronomic factor is what I call it. And what that means is I take the principles that I understand in the sense of soil chemistry, and I determine how much, or estimate how much availability is going to be available, either because we have a poor soil imbalance, maybe we have a high pH. All that has to deal with how much is available. So once we have that final number, we spread that out over the life of the crop. This here is a representation of a 60-day cannabis crop. and you can see how your allocation is. Like I said, it's just a roadmap. It's getting that grower mind set up so that he understands how he's going to get from point A to point B, and that's pretty much from the start of the crop to the end of the crop. Oops. So understanding crop requirement, and this is important. One of the most important things I would say is a necessity to grow a crop, period, if you want to do it precisely, is understanding crop requirement. And there's not a lot of data out in the hemp and cannabis world. We've been working on it with regards to developing uptake curves, but you guys can do it with just sending samples into the lab and taking samples and taking that data and curving out the requirements over time throughout a life of the crop. And so once you have that data, you now have the ability to provide the appropriate amount of fertility within that life cycle of that crop. And you know it to a pound or to a ppm level. So it's a pretty cool tool. And we do this a lot. Dr. Tim Hartz out of Santa Cruz County, or excuse me, UC Davis, was the leader that put this together in the conventional ag world. And it's just taken off. And it's opened up so many people's eyes on how crops take in nutrition and what their requirements are. So once we have that budget, now this is where the work begins. This is getting into growing the crop. So how do we make adjustments as we're growing that crop? And typically we want those adjustments to happen quickly, right? In a lot of cases, people have done soils and are like, well, I got this 2 weeks ago, and I'm already past that point. I don't even need to worry about it. I made the adjustment, right? It's about monitoring nutrition and doing it on a regular basis. A lot of people might take a tissue and say, no, that's good for, the first part of the crop, and never take another tissue throughout the whole, when they're finishing off the crop, if they're in flower or whatever it might be. The problem is it's dynamic. The curve, all nutritional uptake curves are half bell curves. That means it starts off at low demand, and it escalates, and then it eventually peaks off. And so that's telling you that it's dynamic, and that goes for every single element, and those curves are different in the sense of number of rates, if it's pounds per acre, or if it's parts per million. So it's very variable with regards to different crops and varieties. So what we do is we have tools as agronomists. So we have suction lysimeters. So this is a really cool technology that we own. Over about 7 years ago, I came across a partner of mine that had this technology. I didn't even know it existed. And now we have it over 150,000 acres. It's a great technology if you're growing in soil, because what it does, it gives you an eye level or eye view of what's going on in the root zone and below the root zone in the soil, in the sense of nutrition, salt loads, that kind of thing. We also utilize feed and drain in our greenhouse systems. So we can supplement the lysimeter for a feed and drain. For a saturated paste, but we utilize the feed and drain and sat paste to kind of link those two together. So with feed and drain, this is kind of what's standard in most houses, or glass houses, or indoor, because we're typically not growing in, it might be what we call substrate. Substrate, a lot of people call it non-native soil. Soil, there's specific things that define a soil, and most of the growing media that we have are not soil. They're a growing media. They're a substrate, right? We can put things into that media that can mimic a soil, but it's not true soil. We can utilize tissue analysis, and we can utilize petioles, sap. These are all our tools, okay? So about a few years ago, well, it's been more than a few years ago, unfortunately, but it's been about 6 years ago, Ag Laboratory developed source-to-sink nutritional monitoring. And this is a technique to monitor nutrition through the cycle, or through the flow of nutrition from its sources, through the soil solution, into the plant, and through the actual plant, and how it's translocating in the plant. So did I skip one? So with regards to lysimeters, so lysimeters play a big role in this, so this is more applicable for soil type systems. You could also do it in substrate if you're in bigger bags, because we can fit a lysimeter into bags. So why utilize a lysimeter? Well, the reason is soil solution, which is what is carrying the nutrition. So whatever nutrition comes out of the soil is going to concentrate in the soil solution, the water that's in the soil. And that's what's delivering it to the crop through transpiration. And so 98% of all plant nutrition are directly supplied from the soil solution through mass flow. And some of you guys, if you guys have agronomy background, you think, wait, 98? That's a little high. It's actually 93 if you read most textbooks. The reason why it's higher is because there's a process called diffusion, and that diffusion is when the plant exudes hydrogen to lower the pH of the exchange site on the soil, which eventually dissolves the element and puts it in the water, then it gets taken up through mass flow. So there's actually more going through mass flow than actual any other aspects of taking in nutrition. 2% will be done through cation exchange. You have root interception as well as diffusion, okay? So there's a very small amount, and it takes a lot of energy for the plant. The plant consumes energy to mine nutrition from the soil. This here is a method that which is the amount of energy required is a lot less than the other aspects. So 3 variables that contribute to the chemistry makeup of soil solution. You have the biological and the chemical makeup of the soil, your irrigation water, and your fertilizer. Those are the 3 things that make up that. You've probably seen some of this before. This is a mass flow chart, a nutrient uptake chart. This is what nutrients are able to be taken up through mass flow, diffusion, and root interception. So that kind of gives you an idea of the differences. That's why we're looking at the soil solution, why it's so important. And you'll see that as I get into some of this data. So this is just a pictogram of what makes up soil solution. Kind of gives them more. And so what we do is we utilize a lysimeter. So if nobody has heard of a lysimeter or a suction lysimeter is an artificial root, if you want to call it that. And what we do is we apply a vacuum on a tube that has a ceramic tip which is about 1 or 2 micron ceramic tip, and it pulls soil solution into that tube. And it pulls it. There's a lot of these over the counter, but we designed one that can pull over time, and that's critical. But what happens is we put about 22 centibars on the vacuum to mimic osmotic pressure and that pool of nutrients. Okay, so this is the whole idea. This is what when I came across the technology, this is what I wanted to be able to map out. Because before that, the tools we had was tissue, water analysis, and soil analysis. So I had this, and I had this. I was missing a key component because this is where all the action's happening. If I have antagonistic issues going on because of chemistry, it's going to happen here. It's not happening up here. Now, it will eventually. You'll start to see symptoms. But monitoring from the source through the soil solution into the sink, which is the plant. Okay? So here's an example of some lysimeter data. So what we do is we actually put in a 12-inch. This one happened to be 12 and 24. It depends on the crop type because it's where the roots are within the soil profile. And this can be done, like I said, in substrate. So if you're in bags, you could put one lysimeter in that, and you could pull that soil solution. Another quick way of doing it in soil or greenhouses and stuff is doing a sap paste. And you could do that out in the soil, or in soil applications. But the problem with that is it's very time-consuming and labor-intensive. These are once they're installed, they're very easy to maintain. So, anyways, this data here is representing the root zone. Okay, for this particular crop. This is below root zone. You can see here that EC, sodium, and chloride are extremely high. So we're getting build up of those two particular elements, which is causing a complete imbalance in the system. And so you can see over here, your nitrogen, your phosphorus, your potassium, calcium is all pretty significantly balanced. I mean, you got some lower numbers there, but they're still good. So what happens is we then trend that data. This is where we do a lot of our work, or at least I do, when I'm looking at the data. So I want to see whether or not, am I trending down, am I trending up, am I stable? And we do this over time. And so like, for instance, here, this particular grower, this is live data. This particular grower started off with extremely high sodium, relatively high chlorides. Look at the nitrate, very high. So what's happened over time, over the growing window, it's starting to decline significantly. And so what does this tell me? Well, he's probably managing his salts pretty well, okay? You can see EC replicated that, right? Same trajectory. So this is the data that we can use to pull out, hey, do we need to apply more fertility? Like here, I'm not going to apply a whole lot of nitrate because I have significant amount, of well over what we need. So we go through all the different analytes. The one thing that we don't have on here we're working on is getting the minors in there, but because they're typically semi-soluble, you don't get a lot of hit unless you're applying the fertility in, or you have really good soil chemistry, which is very hard to come by no matter where you go. So it takes a lot of hard work to get good soil chemistry. Using lysimeters to calculate fertilizer loads. So this is primarily in the soil applied side, but there is a way to convert this over if you're used to talking pounds per acre, or if you're talking pounds per square foot, whatever it might be. But there's an actual calculation to convert those parts per million, because that's what we're reading. We're reading parts per million in the lysimeter. And so what's happening is if you're running about 30 parts per million of nitrogen, and we take and consider soil pore space, we also take in soil holding capacity and leach fraction, that's going to equate to about 2.5 pounds per acre foot of nitrate. Okay? Anybody know how many pounds it typically takes if you're growing in soil to support a crop in peak vegetative growth? 7 to 10 to 12 pounds per acre per week. And this is a lot of people say, well, I'm growing almonds, or I'm growing head lettuce, or I'm growing cannabis. Almost every one we've done on the nutrient uptake curves, they're almost all the same in the total requirement. They're close. They're not all exactly the same, but they're close. They're within the same ballpark. The difference between it, and this is where you hear a lot of the growers like, well, I grow a different crop. It's completely different. Well, it's the timing of application. That's where it's completely different. But the total number of units that are being taken in is pretty close across almost every single crop you can imagine. Going from head lettuce to grapes to avocados, they're all relatively similar. Let's see here. So this is an example of a feed and drain analysis. This is what we're utilizing in the greenhouses, in the indoor facilities. And it's very important to understand, hey, how much are we feeding? And typically I want to see that drain. Now, typically you want to see a 20 to 30% drain. And the reason is I have to understand how much the plant's taking in. If I can calculate those margin difference, how much I'm coming in, how much is going out, then I can understand how much the plant's taking in. The one thing I have noticed, though, is most of the medias that we're utilizing, so cocoa fiber, perlite peat moss, they have an artificial holding capacity. So what we've seen is that we're getting accumulation of certain cations or anions in that solution, or in that growing media, and it's not coming out the bottom. So what's happening, we're getting salt burn even though we think we're leaching. In reality, we're not. We're accumulating them in the actual, if it's a bag, or if it's a tub, or whatever it might be. So this is some of the data that we utilize for that. And we're looking at pretty much all the macro and micro elements. So once we have that data, so that's telling us how much are we feeding, how much do we have in the so-called bank. So that bank could be your soil, or that bank could be your growing media. The next is to determine how is the plant taking it in, and not just that, is what is the plant doing with it. Are we supporting the plant to its full requirement? And so what we ended up doing, and this is actually came to us by mistake. We fell into this in the sense of trying to figure out correlating data from lysimeters to tissue. What we found out is standard tissue analysis, the protocol with regards to pulling tissue, not on all crops, but majority of the crops, is the first fully expanded, fully functioning leaf. Okay, it's on new growth. The problem with that is when you're only looking at that placement on the architecture of the plant, you're not taking into consideration translocation. Plant has the ability to move nutrients, and typically they're moving them from stored energy, which is the older tissue, into the newer tissue. And when the plant does that, now the plant will naturally senesce certain leaves. Typically shaded leaves will senesce off. But if you have in mid-tier canopy where you have good healthy leaves, older leaves, those should not senesce off. They should not change color unless you're stressing the plant. And that's what's happening. You're typically fertilizing, or you have fertilizer stress. You're causing the mobile nutrients to move from that old tissue to the new tissue. So anyways, we came up with this, and the reason was we want to identify and be able to measure whether or not we're getting a deficiency early in the cycle or early in the crop versus waiting a month or two to identify that. And so, excuse me. So this is some examples to support this, and I didn't know that. I mean, like I said, I've been around in the industry for a little while, and I had to dig back through a lot of the agronomy side, books and documents, and I came across multiple sources, and I don't know why it didn't dawn on me, but it didn't. When we look for a deficiency, we're looking on the lower end of the plant. We're not looking on the top end of the plant. The only time we look for a deficiency on the top end is for minors, because those are semi-immobile, or semi-mobile, and calcium, because it gets locked in the cell wall. So when you look for deficiencies, this is where you look for them when it comes to the big ones, NPK and mag. Those are where you're going to look at. For calcium and your minors, it's in new tissue, new growth. And so that's what determined you need to pull two tissues, because if you're pulling this leaf, you're not going to see this deficiency until it's pretty much pulled all the reserves from all these leaves all the way up to there, and then that becomes deficient because it can't keep up. So you're a month, 2 months behind. So we can see deficiencies a month or 2 months sooner depending on the crop and the time of the year. Here's another example. This is from the University of, I believe it's Michigan. The other one was from the International Plants Institute. So there's data out there that shows that that's the way we should be sampling, and this goes across all crops. We do it in almonds, we do it in cannabis, we do it in everything, as long as it's a complex leaf structure. There's some other ones out there like spinach. You just take the whole plant. All right, so this is some of the data. So you can see here, this is old or new tissue. This is old tissue. So if you want to look at it as new, and this is the reserves, you can see where nitrogen is adequate in the new tissue, but it's pulling down in the reserves. So it's telling us that the plant is consuming, it's not getting enough supply. So in order for us to compensate for this, we have to apply more nutrition. If not, this leaf that we pulled, or that level in the plant, is not photosynthesizing as well as it should. It's reducing the carbohydrates and the sugars that it should be creating, and that's all yield. And not to mention, like I mentioned earlier, if the plant moves nutrition from the restored region or restored organ into new growth, it's a cost of energy. That energy could have been utilized for production, not moving nutrition. So we trend the data as well, and you'll see really cool trends where you'll see where this is a nitrogen. You got green and red, green being young, red being old. You can see here, you can see it starts to dive down, and then as it starts to rebound, he started to apply, the reserves start to pick up, and then all of a sudden, so did the new tissue. So you can pull a lot of data out of the trends, and this is stuff because we're looking at a leaf lower in the plant. So the amount of time you have to react, you're very progressive in that process, and you're monitoring with the lysimeter. You're monitoring if you want to call it the table, the food table. It's what's the crop's feeding on. That's just getting into the crop or hasn't gotten into the crop yet. So when you make a decision, a lot of times we won't even see deficiencies in the crop because we'll see it in the data first. You'll never see a visual symptom. And it's definitely doable. So the benefits of monitoring nutrition. As an agronomist, it's huge, okay? The ability to increase crop uptake efficiency. If I'm not measuring, I have no way. You can sit there, hey, how much should I be applying? I don't know. It's not because I don't know, because I don't have the data to support a decision or to tell you, hey, you need to increase it by X amount. So data. Reduction of fertility loss. So you can utilize the lysimeters to optimize your fertility and prevent leaching. So you'll be able to see when you leach. Well, when you leach and you leach out of the root zone, the money you spent for that fertilizer is gone. And you will not get an ROI on that fertilizer. It's a proactive fertility management due to the lysimeter technology. Before, we were always doing tissues and we were looking back in the rearview mirror, if you want to look at that in that way. Now we have the ability to look forward as well through the front window. And so what we're doing is we're looking both ways. We're saying, look, this is what my fertility loads are. This is how they've been trending. This is how I can increase it or decrease it because of whatever the data says. And not just that is, let me see the tissues and let me see how that's affecting it when I make a decision. So this front and back, looking through the front window and looking back the rear view, making sure you're keeping your plants healthy. The ability to see how plants are moving and assimilating nutrition. That's what the strategic tissue. It's that right there. When I came across that by accident, like I said, it opened up the whole new world on how plants move nutrition and how quickly they can become deficient. So the ability to adjust on the fly by using lysimeters, that's just a quick process. Rather than doing a soil analysis, it takes literally 15 seconds to pull a sample out of a lysimeter station. The ability to check on how we're managing by utilizing the strategic tissue. So are we managing our fertility loads properly to sustain crop requirement? So that kind of gets into a very, when you start getting into this level of agronomy and management, one of the things that really starts to become noticeable quickly is how intense it is to manage fertility in mixing properly, in monitoring properly, in all those things. It really starts to intensify the labor requirement. So this is where automation came in. This is kind of how we got into the automation business about 10 years ago. And so what happens is there's ways to automate. And a lot of guys, especially in the hemp and cannabis industry, I see a whole host of what we call entry-level automation. So it might be a dosatron or a mix-right, or all the way into full reader systems that are fully automated. We're utilizing PAR and infrared to control our irrigation, all that stuff. And so with automation, there's a couple of things. It's executing a recommendation is probably 90% of the battle. And some of the PCAs or agronomists out here understand that, because a grower has so many hats. And even in the, 5 minutes, okay, sorry. Okay, so anyways, the automation side is something where you can eliminate the labor side of it. And so I'm just going to flip through here because I want Kyle to get up here because we only have 5 minutes apparently. So some of the challenges are the upfront costs, the installation or retrofitting of existing infrastructure can be challenging, steep learning curve of the software logic. Okay, those are some of the things you want to look at. What part of the operation can be automated and can't be automated sometimes, and then the manufacturer support. So having somebody there to support you with that equipment. So here's just some examples of what we've done. So this is an outdoor facility. This is actually cannabis. Here's some indoor equipment and facilities. So all this stuff is we're utilizing that as agronomists. And most agronomists are very aware of how to operate that equipment, okay? Here's the reader's equipment, which is extremely, reader's the largest automated equipment manufacturer in the world for greenhouses. And then that's about it. So I'm going to just kind of skip through this and get Kyle up here as quickly as I can, and hopefully he can have a conversation with you guys. So thank you for your time. Actually, while he's getting... Okay, you good? What's the next one? The next... No, who, or when, excuse me.
Okay, how's everybody doing? I don't have a clicker or my presentation. Is this the clicker? Yep. Kyle Maccabee. Well, while he's doing that, I'll introduce myself a little bit. Like Eryn mentioned, my name is Kyle Maccabee. I'm a pest control advisor, certified crop advisor. Eryn kind of spoke a little bit on what those were. I do have about a decade of experience, a little less, in agriculture, large scale, small scale, kind of same thing as Eryn. Coming from that industry, Eryn kind of touched on it, the cannabis industry, the agricultural industry has trended towards organic. So we do have a lot of experience in organic and conventional, meaning, the synthetic pesticides that we all know are out there. Like Eryn said, if you have an operation where you have manipulated Mother Nature, and that's what it is when you're growing a plant, you're manipulating Mother Nature, you're going to typically have pest pressures. So as much as everybody would like to not have to deal with pesticides, so to speak, it comes up. The pesticides don't have to be the evil Monsanto or some toxic chemical that we're applying on the plants. And I think us as agronomists, PCAs, agriculture, the hemp and cannabis industry, we've really evolved that and tried to move away from the nuke everything mentality and using of toxic chemicals. So, sorry, I think this is the wrong presentation that was pulled up on here. Just bear with me. Can you pull up the thumb drive? No. It would be that one. Yes, sir. Sorry about that. Anyway, so all that being said, as much as all of us would like to not have to spray anything, and oftentimes we do get lucky and have situations where, yeah, we made it through a full cycle and didn't have to spray anything. We had none or very little pest pressure. And that's what it's all about, is pest pressure, tolerance levels. You don't necessarily have to treat something as soon as you find one insect, like spider mite, for example, or just a little bit of botrytis, which, it's all about the situation. So I am the owner of Caligrow. We have come into this industry to provide you guys some of the actual materials that we're using in agriculture. I've hand-selected a few materials. Not everything is a match for this industry, but I'll go over a few of those and talk about a few of the regulatory issues that the cannabis industry and hemp face. So I'm an affiliate with the ALC Consolidated, and you can see that on there. Oh, nothing's going to go right, is it? I will make this as quick as possible. There we go. So Caligrow, pesticides, fertilizers. As I've kind of mentioned, laboratory services, pesticide supply. Pesticides do not, that name has a connotation. It doesn't necessarily, like I said, doesn't mean it's a synthetic. Pesticide can be a natural derived citric acid, for example, if you're going after powdery mildew. Naturally derived things are what constitutes organic. So if you're targeting a pest of any kind, it is a pesticide. So don't let that word scare you. Like I said, natural, synthetic, that's kind of the conventional versus organic terminology. IPM, so that plays a big part in any person that's going to grow a plant or farm, and somebody that wants to do it right with stewardship of the environment in mind, while keeping economics and pest control, in mind as well. Again, organic versus conventional. I think everybody, has heard these terms, obviously. Connotations again, that's fine, but organically grown food is usually, if and when you do have to apply pesticides or fertilizers or any sort of addition to your cropping system, it's typically based around naturally derived, BT materials, which is a beneficial fungus that will kill certain insects, and conventional, again, being synthetic-based materials that kill pests. Organic production based around the National Organic Program that was founded, I believe it was in 1990. Yeah, Organic Foods Production Act. Anyway, because we're short on time, I'll kind of skip over that. This, getting into kind of regulations with the cannabis and hemp industry, there's a lot of gray area, a lot of black area, not a lot of clear area, and it's getting better. We're starting to understand where the EPA or the federal government stands, in addition to where state and local governments and regulations stand. And what I would like everybody to understand is that in California, if you are growing ag or cannabis, it is the responsibility of the DPR. They are the regulatory agency over pesticide applications, and they are in charge of cannabis and hemp. So the DPR stands for Department of Pesticide Regulation. We deal with them in agriculture, and it is the same for cannabis and hemp. So as mentioned, cannabis and hemp, DPR is in charge. They've created a couple guidelines that it's becoming much more clear, and I can try to help you guys, walk you guys through that if you are interested in what's legal, what's not. Make sure you guys aren't breaking any rules, investing all this money, and then find out you have applied something that has rendered your crop unsellable. So their website, I do want to touch on that because it would be a good tool for everybody in here. It's right there at the top, so if you needed a picture of that, it's dpr.ca.gov/cannabis, and you've got a bunch of links there that will explain where we stand with regulations. There's a look of what that website looks like. Here's a very important box. This is a kind of 2 or 3 part thing to understand with pesticide regulation, and that is that the DPR has released these guidelines saying here's what it takes to legally apply a pesticide of any kind in cannabis or hemp. So number 1, if you start at the green box up top, it has to be a material that is EPA exempt for residue. In any pesticide or insecticide or anything like that applications, there's an MRL. It stands for maximum residue limits. So there are certain materials, coincidentally, mostly of them are organic, so it kind of pushes this industry towards organic, which is great. The EPA, any material, and there is a list, I'll show you an example list, it's on that website of what active ingredients constitute that residue tolerance requirement. Beyond that, the label, every pesticide has a label, and it talks about what crops you can spray this on. If it's not listed on the label, you're not legally allowed to apply it. So you can either be FIFRA 25B exempt, which means you do not have MRL limits on that, and that means it's not EPA registered, so it's got nothing to do with the EPA or the federal government. Or the label must be broad enough to make the claim that yes, cannabis and hemp can be applied, or it states cannabis and hemp on the label. And here's an example. There's an example of the list they have. It's not limited to that, but again, rosemary oil, azadirachtin is actually one of them. There's quite a few on there, so that's where you got to start. County Ag Commissioner, every county has a County Ag Commissioner, so contact them with any questions. They are the enforcement division, so if you do something wrong, they will be the ones that catch you, if you will. But they are very helpful in that they would like to come out and have a conversation with you before they have to go to some sort of fine or anything like that. So don't be afraid to talk to them. Again, PCA, folks like myself come out, scout, make recommendations on what to do about a pest if it needs treatment or not. Here's an example of one of the fungicides that we have on we do sell certain pesticides and fertilizers as mentioned. This being one of them. This one is EPA exempt. It doesn't have an EPA number, and it is registered for cannabis and hemp. It's listed on the label. So you're 100% legal. You're not going to run into any issues with this, with MRLs, at least not from this particular material. Going back real quick, that material is citric acid based. It's got about 7 different acids, and it's a fungicide. So you can go after botrytis bud rot or powdery mildew, white mold, those kind of things. Here is real quickly a list of pests that many of you have encountered in your grows. And it's not limited to this, and some of them you may never see, but that's kind of an example. Here's a picture of botrytis bud rot. Botrytis we run into in ag crops as well all the time. It can be economically impacting if you let it go. Again, a little more information. Avoid wetness and humid situations, increase airflow. Make sure if you do have a history of it, you are on some sort of rotation with an organic or conventional material that meets all the previously spoken about criteria. Picture of powdery mildew or white mold. As mentioned in, I think, the panel earlier, powdery mildew, if it does infest, it can spread rapidly on your foliage, on your canes, and it will defoliate and kill your plants if it is allowed to go that far. Another picture of it. Mite damage, I think, again, probably a lot of you have ran into the spider mite issue. Maybe not. If not, then let me know what your secrets are. But this is a typical example of stippling. The mites feed on individual cells on the leaves from the underside typically. There's a picture of the mites under an eyepiece. So recommend that anybody growing has an eyepiece and is looking for these mites. They're really small. That's an egg in the picture as well. Here's an infestation that is gone beyond what I would consider a tolerance level. You're going to have economic loss at that point. You're going to have defoliation and killing plants. UCIPM website, we use it in ag all the time. There's not necessarily a cannabis and hemp list, but many of the pests that we have in agriculture do cross over into this. So that's another website that might benefit any growers. Caterpillars, I think that's pretty common as well. You can see how they chew on the leaves. You can see the frass, which is their poop, I guess, if you want to call it that. But the blackening there, usually a big indication that you have some sort of Lepidoptera or caterpillar. There were a couple examples of active ingredients that do meet California criteria, not specific labels, but those would be the AIs, the BT, Bacillus thuringiensis, and spinosad. Grasshoppers, again, those not really a good option to spray. There are certain things you can do to keep them out, netting, certain things like that, but grasshoppers, if you do run into a big issue, can be a problem. So you have to act on grasshoppers as soon as you see them. Again, there are a couple options. There's others. These are just examples. And there are organic labels of those active ingredients. Aphids, another common one. Another thing that I haven't touched on that I think is very important is beneficial insects. Kind of retro speaking back on the spider mites and a lot of these insect pests. A person can really avoid a lot of these sprays in some situations if they utilize beneficial or predatory insects at the proper. As mentioned, my name is Kyle Maccabee. I am the owner of Caligrow LLC. We have brought over a lot of our experience in agriculture, both organic and conventional, and we're trying to provide some information and materials for cannabis and hemp growers, some direction, if you will, on pest control and fertility. We work with folks like Eryn Gray that spoke right before me, agronomists that really do understand physiology and the concept of farming and making plants do what we want them to do. Today I'm speaking on pests mostly, focusing on that. Eryn touched heavily on the agronomy, which is great. If any of you have the chance to utilize agronomy in your favor, I'd recommend it. Pests in cannabis and hemp can be, just like ag, an economic loss, if you will. So I was winging it the first time anyway, so it's completely different this time, but it sounds good still, right? And whether you like it or not, whether we like it or not, if we manipulate Mother Nature, we do tend to have a little bit of kickback, and oftentimes in plants and agriculture, that is in the form of pests. We create a monoculture where, in situations where pests can take over and damage our babies, our crops, and we have to treat them, whether it be organically or conventional.